I'm not getting any audio. Is anyone else?
Yeah, I've got audio.
Yeah, I don't have any either.
Oh, okay. So we've got the
Oh no,
participants
sorry, I
on
don't
there.
have audio from the main room. I think I could just
Yeah.
hear you guys.
Yeah, I don't hear them at all. Oh dear. Where are you, Oliver?
In Cambridge.
Okay.
But it's sufficiently warm today that it could be somewhere else. But fortunately, it's Cambridge, England.
Have you been attending the conference so far, or like, I'm just curious, has it been working generally, or do you know?
I haven't been to anything so far.
Okay.
I mean, I did a panel yesterday. Was it 2 days ago? It was fine.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we had like, I think 2 people in person, but the Zoom hand was fine.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure what's going on today.
Do you think that can we be heard by the room?
I
We don't
don't.
know.
Can anybody in the room hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah,
Can you hear us?
Oh,
Oh,
they
great.
can hear
yes.
us. Oh,
Can you hear
Oh,
us?
wonderful. Great. Hi. Okay, so I guess is the chair there? Is he there?
Hey.
Can we start?
Okay.
Okay, great. Awesome.
But can we hear them? I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
I can see
We
them
can.
reacting to us, but
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't somebody say something from in there?
oh, I hear something very faint. Okay. Maybe if they need to go by the mic.
Hmm.
Good. Right.
So, hello?
Hi.
Hello.
So go ahead. The chair can start now.
Okay, great.
Okay, so go. Good. Yeah.
Is he there?
If the
Or
chair
should we
is
just
not
find
of the
the chair?
deal,
No, he's not here. I mean, we could get started. I think just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I'm the last person speaking, I'll just like do like a brief introduction and then we'll go. So today is June 22nd. It's great to be here. Thank you to LSA for organizing this panel and to Lynn for writing this book. My name is Alimat Shomat, and I'm at Auburn University in the United States. Our fellow panelists, we have Stephen Pierce, who's speaking from Manchester. Sarah Katz speaking from Accra, but she's at Duke University. And then we have Oliver Coates, who's speaking from Cambridge. We should have another panelist join us very soon, who's speaking from Ibadan. So I guess I'll just turn it. We're gonna speak based on last names, and I believe Sarah is first. So I'm gonna pass the virtual mic to you, Sarah.
All right. All right, well, thanks as always to Saeed for inviting me to join this panel for Lynn Schler's new book, which I greatly enjoyed. As I imagine others will touch on, a particular innovation is using the Israeli archives, which provide rich observations of the inner workings of the political elite in the First Republic. As she notes in the book, many of the Nigerian government documents related to this period are either non-existent or inaccessible. Though I will note that the National Archive branch in Kaduna has the documents related to Ahmadou Bello's office very well preserved. So I was a bit surprised not to see these referenced in the chapter on the North. In any case, I think this book should inspire more investigations using other international archives as a way of glimpsing parts of Nigerian post-colonial politics that are difficult at present to access. Relatedly, another part of the book that struck me is that the Israelis did not just observe that Nigeria as a federation was fragile and might not hold, but they actively encouraged and deepened these divides, such as when they pushed the action group to come down hard against Nasser. It made me wonder how much of the rumors and conspiracy theories the AG propagated against the North were in part encouraged by Israel. And looking over my own research notes, I found at least one news article by a Yoruba journalist expressing concern that Awolowo's aggression toward a Yoruba Muslim political party was instigated in part by Israel. While much has been written about how various nations interjected themselves into the Biafran Civil War, I think a future project this book points to would be to consider how much international diplomacy with different nations, not just Britain, played off of divides within the new post-colonial state. So I'll offer a few points now that I hope will generate a productive discussion. The first is on the genre of diplomatic speech, if we can call it that. So in the 5th chapter on the North and the NPC's relationship with Israel, the book presents a dichotomy between what politicians say in public as for show or serving their personal brand, so to speak, in contrast to what is said behind closed doors in meetings between Israeli and Nigerian politicians as being what politicians really think. The NPC's relationship with Israel involved a lot of ups and downs, and while no doubt, as the author describes, sometimes the downs are connected to specific blunders by Israel, I found myself wondering in some cases if perhaps the NPC was playing a game with Israel, not wanting to commit to them if they absolutely didn't need their help, since it might negatively impact their relations with Saudi Arabia, but also happy to keep Israel perpetually on the back burner should a desperate situation of need present itself in the future. Which is to say, I wasn't quite convinced that Ahmadou Bello's public condemnations of Israel were necessarily any less sincere than his occasional private suggestions of a future alliance. So particularly since the key methodological innovation is using diplomatic documents, I would be keen to hear more from the author of how she understands the genre of diplomatic speech and what methods she used to critically read these. In short, how does one distinguish between moments of honesty and moments where politicians are telling the Israeli diplomats what they think the Israelis want to hear, or what version of the truth they think will best serve their political agenda? Moving on, I found the chapter on the farm settlements in the Western region, modeled on Israeli cooperative farm settlements, to be particularly interesting, and it provides a nice counterexample to the way that post-colonial politics sometimes gets generalized as quickly being corrupt and about filling the pockets of politicians and their networks. Rather, here we have an example of a government policy that saw development projects as part of the democratic process of winning over voters. So it's a very different view of the post-colonial state than Bayart's politics of the belly. Another key contribution is that the book takes the aspirations and political work of the First Republic seriously, despite its tragic end. And I think it demonstrates the value of rich, detailed studies focused on a tight chronological time frame. No doubt this is due to the fact that, as the author mentions, once you get the Israeli occupation of the West Bank in 1967 and then the October War of 1973, perceptions of Israel deteriorated across Africa, Nigeria being no exception. But I was wondering if the author has a sense of the aftermath or any lingering impact of this history. We get a bit of this in the chapter on the farm settlements, which ends by remarking that some of the settlers still live near the failed farms and now cultivate a nostalgia for this project, even though it failed, because it reminds them of a past when the state invested in rural development. We are told that the farmers suffered immediate and long-term consequences. And here I was curious to kind of learn more about the life trajectories of these settlers. How many remained in the rural setting despite taking pride in being school leavers? Did the farm settlements at least succeed in changing school leavers' perceptions of farming as a worthy vocation? To this theme of aftermath, I'll add that in my own research on the Nigerian Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage, the legacy of Israeli-Nigerian relations in the First Republic clearly registers in the lead up to the 1983 presidential election, where the incumbent, Shehu Shagari, warned in a campaign speech that if the winner was Awolowo, the challenger, because of his close relationship with Israel, the Hajj would end abruptly because this would anger Saudi Arabia. While this was no doubt mere rhetoric, Awolowo still felt he needed to respond, going so far as to say that actually he, Awolowo, would be best for the Hajj because he would end Shagari's pilgrim quotas, allowing the Hajj to not be constrained by the fragile economy. Which brings me to mention that Nigerians, apart from state politics, had by this point long been connected to Jerusalem through religious pilgrimage. Back when Muslims traveled to Mecca by road, given the scale of this undertaking, many opted to combine their pilgrimage with visits to other important Islamic sites, such as Cairo and Jerusalem. This was also the route taken by the Emir of Kano in 1937, during which he met with the Mufti of Jerusalem. And in looking through kind of archival files of repatriation cases, it is not uncommon to find Nigerians spending years, sometimes even starting families, in Israel. Such itineraries continued into the 1960s. The Abu Jaleh of Ejebuland tacked on a trip to Israel after his Hajj in 1962, during which he was presented a brochure by Golda Meir. And among the letters written to Ahmadou Bello asking for financial sponsorship for the Hajj, several pleaded for funds to also visit Jerusalem. Meanwhile, since the first Muslim Pilgrims Board was established in 1958 in the Western region, Christian Muslims had called for their own state-sponsored pilgrimage to Israel. And while they'd have to wait until the 1980s for this to happen, churches and Christian organizations did begin organizing pilgrimages during the First Republic. And so both Awolowo and Ahmadou Bello certainly, and likely other politicians, were aware of Israel as a site of religious travel by Muslims and Christians. And so I was curious if this ever came up and how aware the Israeli diplomats were of this. And finally, a fairly basic question I have is how Israel's diplomatic ties with Nigeria compares to other African countries in this time period. There is brief mention of Niger and Ghana, but what struck me was how haphazard Israel's approach was in Nigeria. Perhaps not unlike the British, they often assumed they could quickly grasp the political landscape, failing time and again to do so. So I was wondering if this was the case for Israel in other African countries, or did Nigeria's weak federation prove particularly challenging for them? All right, thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I actually realized that Oliver was supposed to go first. So giving the last name, but I went in conversation. I thought about you. So I'll just pass the virtual mic to Oliver.
Sorry, Oliver.
Thank you very much. I was quite happy not to be given the burden of starting off, so I was very happy with that. So thank you very much to Sahid for inviting me to participate in the panel, and also to learn for the book as well. I think that the approach that Lynn takes in the book goes some way towards framing the international relations of Nigeria and what she describes in the introduction as more or less a Nigeria-centered, or in the words of a different scholar, she quotes in the introduction, an Afrocentric approach to Nigeria's foreign relations. So therefore, it brings the subject of diplomacy and external relations into policy making, but also kind of social and economic development in the First Republic. And the late colonial period. So, for example, in the farm development programs and in the kind of intervention of Israeli diplomats in an increasingly ethnicized and regionalized politics in Nigeria in the late 50s and early 60s. So this offers a quite a distinct way of framing external relations, and it differs significantly from some earlier literature on Israeli therefore focused on particular themes and issues, particularly Biafra itself. So in that way, I think Lynn's book marks important departure, not only in the specific field of Israel-Nigeria relations, but also into the question of how historians write the external relations of African states and consider the full dimension on a range of historical actors of those external relations. There are a number of dimensions of the book which I think are relevant outside of Nigeria's relationship with Israel specifically, and Nigeria's relationship with the wider Middle East and the Islamic world. And this is partly covered in the chapter on the north of Nigeria later on in Lynn's book, which gets involved in the operationalization or weaponization of the Israel-Palestine conflict within the discourse of northern Nigerian politics in the First Republic. And that is effectively the way in which the relationship between the Action Group, but also between some northern and eastern politicians as well, and Israeli diplomats became a propaganda subject for northern politicians, but also for Muslim activists in northern Nigeria for a far wider period of time than the First Republic. So something indicated in her response just now, this became a live and contentious issue throughout the 80s and 90s within Nigeria. So there's a far wider kind of cultural power and contentiousness to the subject than is possible to deal with in the focus on the First Republic. The other kind of significance of the book, I think, in relation to Nigeria Middle Eastern relations is the question of this period of the First Republic, where the influence, for example, of Saudi Arabia in this period was not sufficiently pronounced or developed to constitute a kind of major center of gravity that would become in the 70s and 80s. And this provides, therefore, if you like, a kind of lost way of thinking about Nigeria-Middle East relations before a familiar set of power dynamics that developed in the 1970s, where it's still possible for there to be a relatively multipolar approach to Nigeria's relationship with the Middle East without the educational, financial, and proselytization influences of Saudi Arabia that was developed from the late 1960s. So in that way, it provides a kind of way of thinking historically about Nigeria's relationship with the Middle East that is alternative to the dominant narratives that developed since the OPEC crisis and the spread of a kind of mediatized Wahhabi proselytization in Nigeria in the 70s and 80s. I think there's some areas that are not as represented in the study, but probably because of the choice of kind of categories of analysis that Lynn uses in the book. One of those is Israel's military consultancy and engagement with emerging West African states, whether in terms of land or naval forces or in terms of military aid to secessionism. And this comes after, in the most dramatic examples, just after the period of the book. But it is a kind of major impact, not only on Israel's engagement in West Africa, but also in West African actors' perceptions of Israeli engagement, particularly during the civil war in Nigeria. So I think that that there are some areas that are quite important that fall outside of the primary interest of the book, but which are nonetheless important to understanding Nigeria-Israel relations in the period. I think that a kind of further aspect that is kind of raised in this book, but which would be interesting to look at in more detail, is the way in which Arab states, in dealing with Nigeria, attempted to guard against or to delegitimize Israeli diplomatic efforts. So, if you like, Egyptian or UAR characterizations of Israeli policy in Africa, particularly the accusation of the Nasserist state that there was a kind of neo-imperialist dimension to this foreign policy. And that is something that was quite influential throughout Egypt's dealings with West Africa in the era of Nasser. And it's something that, although it's not created by Nigerian or Israeli actors, is a factor that had a significant influence on the way in which Nigerian actors especially perceived critically, Israeli relations with Nigeria. So I think that those are the kind of like main dimensions that strike me sort of coming out of the book as there is discussion. But I'd like to thank once again Lynn for a fascinating, thought-provoking study, which reframes the way not only in which we have relations, but also the way in which Nigeria or other West African states' foreign relations can be represented historically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Next, we'll have Olisa Mwajana from the University of Ibadan.
Well, thank you, the moderator. And I'd like to thank Lagos Studies Association for giving me the opportunity to read and review Lynn Schler's magnum opus, Decolonizing Independence, Statecraft in Nigeria's First Republic, and Israeli Intervention. Although the book is very concentrated, highly technical, and specialized, it is no doubt captivating and unputdownable. To review such a book, as well as render it in few minutes, is indeed a huge task and a hard road to hell. For the sake of simplicity, let me declare from the onset the structure of my review. I will make a general statement about the problematic of the book, its reason d'etre, and then go ahead to state the high points of the book, followed by the significance and my impression about the book. This book is very timely and significant because it has filled a major knowledge gap on Nigerian history. For instance, to date, only the broad stroke of the history of relations between Israel and Nigeria have been written, and they largely focused on relations between Israel and the federal government, omitting the relations between Israel and the regional governments as well as non-state actors. This study, however, identifies the particular agendas and opposing policies of different regions, parties, and leaders that constituted the mosaic of relations with Israel in the First Republic. Similarly, there is no single history of relations between Israel and Nigeria in the First Republic, but rather a set of parallel and contradictory narratives that reflected Nigeria's conflict as citizen. Lynn Schler's book examines the evolution and outcomes of Israeli intervention in the political landscape of the First Republic as a window into the political cultures, ideologies, and leadership strategies that shaped the nation-state in Nigeria in the transition to independence. It is an attempt to step back from the disastrous outcomes and focus instead on politics in the early years of independence as a realm of aspirations, resistance, and imagination. It examines the arrival of Israel, one of the new actors and allies, offering resources and proposing strategies for overcoming the grave challenges of post-colonialism. It traces the significance and outcomes of the assistance Israel extended to Nigeria. The book draws extensively on the Israeli state archives and the Nigerian archives, as well as interviews for its analysis. I mean, it is a 5-chapter book with introductory and concluding chapters. The introductory chapter states the context and the narrative. It looks at the predicaments and opportunities of the post-colonial moment, noting that the founding of post-colonial states and political cultures were moments that embodied transformation from liberation to freedom. It describes the crafting of the post-colonial state, arguing that the post-colonial statecraft was a contested meeting ground between institutional forms dictated by colonialism and the local cultural resilience and agency. Throughout the post-colonial world, it argues, the transition to independence obliged political elites to transform the state structure, borders, and bureaucracies inherited from colonial rule into tools of power. From colonial era, Nigerian politicians developed an extremely ambiguous relationship with the post-colonial state, seeing it as product and instrument of colonial rule. It is commonplace to refer to the nation-state in Africa as a colonial invention that has remained alienated from local societies. For instance, when independence came in Nigeria in October 1960, it did not lead to a reconciliation between the transplanted states and local society, and weak roots of political institutions continued to plague the system. The study also outlines the tenure, motivation, and domains of Israeli relations with Nigeria, as well as the local response to it. In terms of the tenure, it notes that transition from the last years of colonial rule and into independence, leading figures in Nigeria's nationalist elite established unusually close ties with Israel. Israeli diplomats first reached out to Nigeria in 1957, offering support in a variety of economic and political ventures. This outreach was a part of an Israeli broader incursion into Africa. In terms of the motivation, Israel aims to offset and leapfrog the hostilities emanating from the Middle East conflict by winning over allies among the newly established nations of the post-colonial era. Concerning the areas of relations, Israeli relations with Nigeria evolved into an extensive range of collaborations in economic, political, and social arenas, including infrastructural construction, water development, planning, agriculture, social development, and medical assistance. As regards local response, relations between Nigeria and Israel during the First Republic were driven by political circumstances in Nigeria. Nigeria's fragmented and conflicted nationhood immediately found expression in local response to Israel's offers of cooperation. Consequently, relations with politicians from the southern regions grew at lightning pace, while politicians from the north rejected Israeli overtures and they tried to limit Israeli penetration in Nigeria. The work also presents the events that set the stage for the special relations establishing between the Action Group and Israel in the final years of colonial rule, namely Awo's uphill battle in trying to block British efforts to secure their access to and swear over Nigerian resources after independence. It was a strategy of using ties with Israel to mitigate the British manipulations of the federal system. The study also examines how the early establishment of ties in 1957 suddenly took on immense urgency within the Action Group in 1958, following the establishment of the Nigerian National Shipping Lines. It notes that the early conversation with Israeli diplomats, Awolowo focused on the possibility of Israel aiding the Western region with agricultural cooperatives and he expressed interest in a joint shipping line between Israel and Western region. Action Group officials were not naive about the chances of gaining federal government approval for a joint venture with Israel, and it was known that British shipping companies were working hard behind the scene to preempt this outcome. The way out of this predicament was to find a non-governmental interest that would take it upon itself to establish the joint shipping line with Israel while relying on the inspiration and the encouragement of the Western regional governments. This became the modus operandi of Action Group in the lead-up to independence. The planning and negotiations to establish a joint shipping line between the Western region and Israel, and the eventual failure of the scheme was an important turning point in the early history of Israeli interventions in Nigerian politics. Israeli insistence on establishing commercial agreements as a prerequisite to helping Awo with the 1959 campaign led to the establishment of two joint Israeli-Nigerian corporations that were to play a pivotal role in the history of Action Group. Officially, these corporations were established to facilitate Israeli assistance in the development of Western region, with the companies winning government tenders for large-scale infrastructure projects. But unofficially, these corporations became the instrument through which the Israeli provided clandestine assistance to the Action Group in its pursuit of broader political agenda. The work also offers a close look at three case studies that has to do with the disorder, national incoherence, and foreign relations. Namely, the evolution of ties between Israel and the finance minister of the First Republic, Chief Festus Oketiebo. The second one had to do with the outreach to the Israeli by Aminu Kano, the leader of the Northern Element Progressive Union. The third has to do with the attitudes towards Israeli involvement in Nigeria within a powerful interest group in the Western region, namely the Society of Master Builders and the Western Region Contractors Union. Other than engendering the anger of the other parties, the Israeli assistance to Action Group also opened the way for demands for similar assistance from NCNC politicians who came to recognize Israel as a willing player in the Nigerian politics. Another important area of the study has to do with the various interests that attempted to maximize or leverage ties with Israel. For instance, Action Group leveraged Israeli interests in order to enlist support and also target specific areas of expertise that could be of benefit to Western region. This was achieved by fueling the Israeli fears of what they depicted as ubiquitous Egyptian influence in northern Nigeria. They also did so by telling the Israeli that the Action Group hoped to win enough votes from the Muslim north of Nigeria in order to block a Muslim majority in the federal parliament. Similarly, Oketiebo exploited Israelis' hope for a strong alliance with Nigeria to gain the upper hand against Sardauna. Aminu Kano also tapped into the Israelis' desire for an inroad into the northern region to win support for his election campaign. The master builders and Western region contractors castigated the Israeli incursions in the Action Group in order to prevent their interests in the Western region. In each case, Nigerian overtures reflected resources, maneuvering, and leveraging of foreign nationals and relations. Well, the significance of this study is in the fact that it provided the broader history of relations between Israel and Africa during the 1960s and provides a pivotal contact for understanding Israelis' willingness to become intimately involved in the politics of the First Republic in Nigeria. Relations between Israel and Nigeria in the era of decolonization must also be understood against the backdrop of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly prior to 1967. The study views political action in the early years of the First Republic as a reflection of the ambivalent and negotiated relationship between the post-colonial ruling elite and the inherited colonial political structure. It enables us to rethink the nature, scope, and dynamics of the Nigeria's foreign relations in the First Republic. The study is a veritable instrument for ascertaining the historical process of continuity and change in the political history of Nigeria. For instance, it shows that some of the political ills bedeviling contemporary Nigeria have been endemic since the First Republic. For instance, it notes that the undemocratic behavior was enhanced in manipulated elections and census, a profound lack of tolerance for opposition, the courts, elections, constitutional amendments, and the authority to declare a state of emergency all became tools to obliterate opposition, as is the case in the present-day Nigeria. By and large, the history of the democratic process in the First Republic reflected only a lip service acceptance of democracy. Thus, the First Republic collapsed when democracy was reduced to nothing more than a set of performative gestures that were eclipsed by undemocratic moves. The study also shows that decolonization.
I'm sorry, Olisa. Olisa, could you please wrap up your presentation?
I'm summarizing.
Move on to the,
I'm summarizing.
Thank you so much.
I'm summarizing. The study also shows that decolonization only exacerbated ethnic regional competition. And by the time independence came, the Nigerian political scene was synonymous with the inter-ethnic struggle for power and resources as we have them today. It demonstrates that no social and economic problems in Nigeria was so urgent as that of finding employment for the increasing number of school leavers. This remains the situation up to today. And finally, the aversion to agriculture by young school leavers of today is not something new. The study cited Daily Times editorial that schooling had fostered a negative attitude towards farming because farming and cutting grass was done as a means of punishment. However, it would be nice for the study to go beyond the politicization of the farm settlement scheme as a reason for its failure, but look at other factors, social, cultural, and economic, in order to provide against the historiographical aversion to monocausal explanation in history. The issue I have raised is a matter of intellectual exercise and does not affect the intrinsic merits of the book, and I, however, recommend it for further and everlasting immortalization and celebration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olisa. Stephen?
Okay, well, so thank you to Saheed and the LSA team for giving me the invitation to sort of talk on this panel. The problem of coming in at number 4 is that you will see that much of what I have to say already has been said, wonderfully well by Sarah Oliver and Olisa. So I'm going to try to be fast so that I don't try your patience too much. It really is a pleasure to be talking about this book. It is fascinating, both in its the sort of relatively defined, clear subject matter it explicitly avows, and much more broadly in the much more ambitious set of interventions it is making in sort of Nigerian history, African history, post-colonial history. And so I'm going to try to give you a few thoughts about these sort of wider contributions Professor Schler has made and sort of ways in which we might pursue them further than she was able to in this one project. So to begin with, I think that, her sort of distinctive sort of methodological and thematic choice to concentrate on the relationships with Israel and this new set of historical evidence takes us beyond really what has been too much of the scholarship on the First Republic, which takes that period as either a case study of dysfunction or an opportunity to valorize some particular subset of the political actors in the period. You know, you've got your good guys and you've got your bad guys. Professor Schler's problematic forces us beyond this relatively sort of defined set of analytic strategies. This fits in with one, I think, of the most welcome sort of developments of this century of scholarship. That is to say, the move away from focusing only on north-south or relatively localized regional interactions and toward an acknowledgement that the world has always been multipolar, and multipolar in a very complex way, not just interactions within the Islamic world or around the Atlantic basin. Professor Schler's very problematic suggests the sort of necessity of looking at relationships which might not at first glance or among the ignorant seem to be so analytically worthwhile. This book really, I think, is a landmark in bringing Nigeria's global history out of sort of imperial or regional or Cold War constraints. So, thinking about this specific problematic, I think it is sort of necessary to acknowledge that the history of Israel's relations with Nigeria, that history is fascinating, not just because of its intrinsic importance. So it's not just the history of a relatively small industrialized country and military power, but it is also important because of Israel's embattled position within the Middle East, which of course has and continues to have uneasy resonances with Nigeria's own religious and ethnic politics. So, this relationship with Israel tells us something very specific about Nigeria as well. As Sarah suggested, Professor Schler's opening up of the Israeli archival sources provides important new insights into Nigerian politics, the politics at the federal level within the Western region, the politics of development, the politics of corruption, the sort of viewpoints, the motives of Israeli diplomats give us a really fascinating sounding, which changes the ways in which we can appreciate these histories, giving us fresh accounts of relatively familiar stories. Thus, she helps us to overcome a tendency to see, for example, Obafemi Awolowo as a Westerner or a Yoruba leader instead of the Nigerian leader he also was. I mean, I thought that one of the most powerful elements of this book was the way in which she sort of very strategically used the sort of rhetoric and the symbolic universe within which her sources existed as a way of thinking about individuals as Nigerians, something which, of course, was very hotly contested during the time of the First Republic. So the unique strength of this book, then, is the way in which it combines the insights of Israeli diplomats with Professor Schler's acumen as a first-rate historian of Nigeria, allowing her to transcend the misconceptions and blind spots of her sources. I want to suggest in a minute, its book isn't fully successful in doing that, but it really is quite remarkable. My text just bounced down. So I want to say something briefly about two particularly fascinating stories she tells us. So the first and more easily contained one is the story of the Western region's farm settlement scheme, which on the one hand appears as a relatively familiar account of large development projects that failed because of their inability to take local farmers' practices and interests into consideration. The story that Schler develops here is of a hybridity between Western Nigeria's political patronage system and Israeli models of farm settlements embedded in a rhetoric of developmentalism that was distinctively different from Euro-American or state socialist models of development. She concludes this chapter with a really intriguing observation that this initiative, given that, it failed, was also something of a template for how rural Westerners came to view the state's promises of patronage. It seems to me that that set of theoretical moves she was making is really rather reminiscent of Lisa Lindsay's contention about the ways in which labor stabilization on the Nigerian railway provided templates for much broader sort of patterns of gender and familial life. So there's a sort of really interesting insight into rural patronage politics that I've never seen anyone articulate as cleverly or crisply as here. So, this really made me think. The other story group, and then it's more limited and sometimes ill-informed attempts to engage other political parties. So, this this strain of the book, of course, is much too complex for me to be able to say anything in the very little bit of time I've got left for talking. Let me just say that the sort of Israeli perspective on Awolowo and Akintola and those sorts of interior politics and the sort of brilliant reading Professor Schler has of the Coker Commission, which I found sort of particularly stimulating, gives us a sort of much finer grained appreciation for the sort of very fraught politics of the Western region, from sort of 62 to 60. And I also really his role. Let me just say briefly, I thought that Professor Schler was really wonderfully insightful about the stresses within the NPC-NC coalition, although in some ways I'd like her to expand that into an entire book, because what she had room to discuss here ended up being rather too constrained by the perspectives of her own sources. Let me just finish. I mean, sort of my own research interests are in the northern part of the country, and let me say something about the book I wish she'd written instead of the one that she really does. I really just want to be unfair to her. I mean, it seems to me that for all of her acknowledgement of nuance and the sort of way in which diplomats did appreciate the Sardona's changeability, the sort of multiple constraints the prime minister faced. At the same time, the account sometimes does verge on trafficking the same kinds of caricatures. Thus, it seems to me that a very interesting discussion of Israel's relationship with Aminu Kano and Nepu would have been much richer if she had more fully acknowledged just how politically weak Nepu was, certainly everywhere outside Kano, but we're certainly within, even within Kano, its limitations, and if she had embedded it more fully in the much richer intellectual history of exactly these periods, which is being developed sort of around sort of scholars like Muhammad Sani Umar and Samela Suleiman. There would be a possibility, I think, with sources that are relatively readily available for us to combine the sorts of insights that Professor Schler has brought to us with other recent elements of the historiography to get a kind of nuance which might parallel the nuance this book already provides to the politics of the action group. I've intruded on your patience long enough, so let me conclude just by thanking Professor Schler for this sort of wonderful book, which I've been looking forward to for several years, and I very much look forward to seeing what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So I am going to move on to mine and be as brief as I can be so we can allow our author to share our thoughts on some of the questions that we've raised. I think some of the things that I think we all kind of like find similar stories sort of very resonant in the course of listening to the other panelists. So basically what I did was, first of all, obviously, I thank the LSA organizers for inviting me and for allowing us to have a conversation with the author about our book. So one of the things that I thought of doing is to use some of the case studies that I found resonating as a means of sort of explaining some of the book's intervention. Sorry. Okay. I don't think I could share and look at my notes at the same time, so I'm just going to speak. I think one of the things that I found very striking about the book was the story of Aminu Kano. And I think Aminu Kano's politics and his insight, as well as his foreign policy tactics, were very exceptional and exemplary in a lot of ways. Because one of the things that I found really interesting when, Lynn sort of gestured to Kano's story was, started in 1958 when he has this conversation with the Israeli Foreign Ministry about seeking financial support for his party, the Northern Elements, the Northern Elements Progressive Union, during the 1954 election. And the 1954 election is a big theme throughout the entire book. And you can see this big contrast in terms of, Kano's request for support from the Israeli in contrast to Awolow's support. And, Kano is described in the book as the lesson, he is a lesser known political contender, in the history of Northern Nigerian politics, and someone that we should all kind of like think more about his ideas. And I think Stephen kind of gestured to this in terms of like the intellectual thought of Kano. So Kano essentially, in this meeting in 1958, asked Israel for 1/3 of the £15,000 that he needed to campaign for the 1958 election. And as using, Israeli archive, Lynn shows that, the Israeli ambassador was very doubtful that Nepu was actually going to win this election. But nonetheless, he encourages the Israeli government to provide resources in the form of money, motor cars, as well as electronic propaganda equipment that would support Nepu's electoral campaigns. And as predicted, Kano party suffered a lot of defeat at the polls. Nepu ended up winning 8 out of the 134 seats into the Federal House of Representatives that was sort of allotted to the northern region. But part of the points here, it's not so much the story of Nepu's failure, electoral loss. That's not the main point that Lynn Shiloh's book was trying to emphasize. The point is what Kano's engagement with Israel tells us about statecraft and decolonization, as well as the history of Nigeria's First Republic. And I think one of the really important points here, which is not always emphasized, it's the need for alternative relationship and as a form of anti-colonial resistance that politicians like Kano, as well as Awolowo, mobilized in terms of their search for new ways of financial support, as well as finding new allies beyond Britain. Because as obviously a lot of historians have shown, Britain's attempt to continue to enforce its own economic policy as well as domination persisted throughout the process of negotiating the process of independence, as well as, you have key policies that were put in place to favor Britain after the end of colonial rule. So it's really important to kind of think more about, the policies of people like Kano, how they're searching for new alternative, beyond the story that often sort of emphasize the conflict among the political parties, to think more about the intellectual ideas about what the end of colonial rule could look like beyond the politics of neocolonialism. And again, obviously, Awolowo and Kano's request from Israel did not necessarily resolve or undermine the politics of neocolonialism, but it's also important for us to keep in mind the ways in which they were thinking about how to transcend some of the limitation that Britain had placed upon Nigeria through its process of demanding its freedom and independence. And as a lot of people have obviously gestured, Lynn's book disrupts, the master narrative of Nigeria's decolonization and First Republic that have deeply emphasized the ruling party's competition for power and action. And we also get the story of competition among the party as well as corruption here, but it's told in a way that emphasizes Nigerian politicians' aspiration, their resistance and imaginaries that they enacted through this relationship with Israel. And she also demonstrates through a really important comparative approach of thinking about, the politics of among not just the politics of the northern region, but the differences in opinion among politicians within the Northern People's Congress that has always been dominated by Ahmadu Bello's presence, showing us, the differences in the opinion, and also taking us to different part of the country in terms of the region, and yet shifting relationship with Israel. At the same time, she demonstrates that Israel's relationship with the Nigerian region was not a singular one. You have differences as well as similarity in terms of how the politicians ask for support. The rhetoric was also very important here because you have this attempt to demonstrate that Nigerian politicians' alliance with Israel was a way to kind of ward off the sort of the encroachment of NASA, of Egypt's NASA into Nigeria. So you have ways in which Nigerian politicians sort of manipulated the existing political landscape as a way of winning Israel's favor. And obviously Israel's own search for allies also contributed to the desire and the demand to connect with the Nigerian politician. But the point here is that Lynn is able to give us an opportunity to think about what this politics and processes look like by comparing the approaches that the politicians used across the different regions of Nigeria. And, by accessing the Israeli archive, one of the things that Lynn also is able to demonstrate is what she calls this backstage politics, because the availability of the sources allow us to really see the ways in which, democratic principles were being undermined behind the scene, how Israel was trying to sort of bolster its own commercial interests, as well as hide this commercial interest during the Cocoa Commission, for example, when the Western region government's policy was sort of put on placed in this center of this Commission of Inquiry in 1962. In this book is the importance of understanding the constraints and the limitation that Nigerian politicians, what they were working, the kind of institutional limitation that existed for them, how they sort of had to maneuver around the existing institution that they negotiated with the Britain or were even imposed on them, how they made sense of it, how they were able to resist this institutional limits, modify it, as well as use it to their advantage. So I think it's definitely not always emphasized that we need to kind of think about what were the political context, the political institution that Nigerian politicians existed in, how did they try to move beyond that, how did they use it to their advantage, as well as how did they resist it. And so we are able to sort of get a multitude of voices of agents in actions, as well as action that shaped the ways that past events in the book unfolded. But as many people discuss, I also really enjoyed the chapter on the farm settlement, which to me does a really important job in terms of demonstrating the ways in which local voices interpreted some of the Israelis' involvement in the development project in the Western region. And it's also another really good example of how Lynn is able to demonstrate the ways that Nigerian politicians use foreign policy-making practices to realize their own political agenda. At the same time, it demonstrates the limits of Israeli technical expertise and the attempt to sort of impose and dictate the terms through which the action group will actually carry out some of this intervention. Because as Lynn mentioned, the model that the action group of governments enacted for its farm settlement was very different from the model that Israel actually implemented in its own case. And one of the reasons why, for example, instead of selling all the farmers together in one space, the Western region government kind of created the farmland in different parts of the region, had to do with local demand and push for greater amenities, as well as for economic development project that would satisfy their own need. So even though, you know, we the book definitely demonstrates, you know, the ways in which sort of Israel was able to impose its own commercial interests to the negotiations that were made between the action group government and the Israeli building companies. You also have the limits through which Israel's attempt to determine the nature of its own intervention was sort of resisted and limited by some of the local interests that existed, as well as the politicians' own political agenda of attracting voters. So to conclude, and I think one of the threads that we see here is the theme of failure. There's a lot of failure. There's a lot of issues of failure that sort of like unfolded, whether or not it's with the farm settlement project, or whether it is in which you have the specific election unfolded. One of the things that asking us to consider here is the way that we tell the story, and that we have to sort of move past or consider and think about, you know, the different factors that contributed to the failure of this, whether or not it was the development project or even the structure of the First Republic, but to actually also think about the contingencies, think about some of the cover-ups, to think about some of the political practices, or even alternative ideas, as obviously Fred Cooper and a lot of people have argued that the politicians were trying to develop, and how it can help us to understand our current political context. And most importantly, as a lot of people have talked about, you have this new opportunity for writing Nigeria's history from the use of Israeli archive. And Lynn has demonstrated, I've done this work really brilliantly here. She didn't just write another book that centered Israel's perspective, but it's a book that not only draws on Israel's archive, oral interviews from Nigeria, as well as archival research in Nigeria, to demonstrate what you see as the sort of like the backstage dealings, the negotiations and conflicts that shaped foreign policy and post-colonial statecraft during the First Republic. So I have one main question to ask Lynn, and this is about the popular perspective on the history of the First Republic, as she told it in the book. As I, read the book consistently, I wanted more of the type of voices, especially the perspective of the farmers that she talked about in the Western Region Farm Settlement Scheme. And I was wondering, and I was thinking to myself, maybe this question is unfair because this is really a book about high politics. But I was also wondering, what are the challenges for Lynn in terms of trying to balance out the need to kind of think about the ways in which the public will read in this moment as it unfolded, and how she sort of dealt with the challenges of bringing that into the story, because you see this popular perspective in the chapter on the farm settlement, but it's missing in other parts of the book. And I wondered, if she considered this as she was writing the book, the kind of challenges that she encountered, and how we can sort of think about high politics differently if there is this consistent way of sort of infusing popular conflict and debates into the conversation. So I'm going to end it there and end it over to. Can the people in Lagos hear us?